Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide, a reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that in 1770, 1 out of every 3 men in Boston was a British soldier? Learn why the Boston Massacre is called the first violent conflict of the American Revolution, and how the colonists were required to feed and house about 2,000 British soldiers.
Picture this. It is a bitterly cold night. It's March 5th, 1770, and you are standing on King Street in Boston. The wind is cutting right through you, but that's not what grabs your attention. It's the sound. The air is absolutely filled with the sound of bells ringing.
And, in a city built almost entirely of wood, bells at that hour usually mean only one thing: fire.
Exactly. So you can imagine the panic. People are pouring out of their houses.
Buckets.
Right, grabbing buckets, looking for smoke. But there is no smoke. Instead, they stumble into a scene of absolute chaos right outside the custom house, shouting, cursing, the flash of steel in the moonlight.
And then the sharp crack of muskets.
And when the smoke finally clears, the snow is stained red. 5 men are dying or dead.
It's a heavy image.
It really is. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are investigating the Boston Massacre. Now, everyone knows the standard school version of this story, right? Redcoats, snowballs, shots fired.
Right. It's usually presented as just a single bad night.
But our mission today is to go way deeper than that. We want to uncover the breaking point. We have a massive stack of sources here. Eyewitness letters written the very next morning, legal transcripts from the trial of the century, and the actual text of the laws that were basically strangling the city.
And when you look at that stack as a whole, you realize this wasn't a random event. It wasn't just a scuffle that got out of hand. It was the explosion of a pressure cooker that had been hissing for years.
And honestly, going through the sources, I was so surprised by how much of this story is about more than just soldiers versus colonists. It's about housing. It's about taxes on playing cards, of all things.
Of course, yeah.
And a lawyer making a truly shocking choice. So let's talk about that pressure cooker. Because looking at the census numbers you pulled from the research, the math is honestly shocking. I knew there were soldiers in Boston, but I didn't realize the density.
It is the literal definition of a military occupation.
Huh.
So in 1770, the population of Boston was about 16,000 civilians. To police them, the Crown had stationed 2 full regiments, the 14th and the 29th, plus artillery companies. That's roughly 2,000 soldiers.
So 16,000 locals, 2,000 troops.
But you have to break that down even further. If you remove women and children from the local population and look specifically at the adult males, the ratio is 1 to 3.
Wow.
1 out of every 3 men walking the streets of Boston was a British soldier.
1 in 3. That creates a crazy mental image. Just imagine walking to your favorite coffee shop today, and every third person you pass is fully armed, wearing a foreign uniform, and is there specifically to police you.
And they weren't just policing the streets, they were everywhere. The sources refer to them constantly as the soldiery or redcoats, and they really stood out. But the intrusion was much more personal than just seeing them on the corner. Which brings us to the Quartering Act of 1765.
Okay, this is one of those things I think we just gloss over in history class. We hear Quartering Act and think, well, the British built some barracks.
Right.
But the reality described in these letters is way more invasive.
Much more. The British simply didn't have enough barracks. So this act legally required colonists to feed and shelter these 2,000 soldiers. We are talking about soldiers living in the colonists' own stables, their outbuildings, local inns, and in some cases, empty rooms right inside private homes.
Wait, so you're working all day to pay taxes you hate, you come home, and there is a soldier, the literal enforcer of those taxes, sleeping in your loft.
Sleeping in your loft, and you are legally required to provide him with bedding, candles, cooking utensils, and this is crucial, alcohol.
You had to buy them alcohol.
The law stipulated a ration of cider or small beer.
That adds such an insult to injury.
It created a domestic friction that is just hard for us to imagine today. The journals from the time are full of incidents, brawls starting because a soldier made a pass at a local woman, or arguments over food. It completely erased the line between public policy and private life.
And speaking of public policy, let's look at the economic vice grip. The sources list a few taxes that were really turning up the heat. We all know about the tea, but the Stamp Act of 1765 seems like it was designed to annoy absolutely everyone, not just merchants.
Oh, it was a bureaucratic nightmare. The Stamp Act required colonists to purchase government-issued stamps for almost any paper product, legal documents, licenses, newspapers. But here is the detail that really highlights the pettiness. The tax applied to dice and playing cards.
Playing cards. So you can't even sit down for a game of whist at the tavern without the king taking a cut.
Exactly. It politicized leisure. Every single time you shuffled the deck, you were reminded of the crown's reach. But the Stamp Act was annoying. The Townshend Acts of 1767 were strategic. This is where the colonists realized the game was actually rigged against them.
I was reading about this in the notes. Usually we think taxes are just about money, paying off war debt. But you're saying the Townshend Acts were about power.
Specifically the power of the purse. Before this, the tax revenue raised in the colonies was used for general costs. But the Townshend Acts earmarked the money specifically to pay the salaries of the royal governors and judges.
Why does that matter, though? Who pays them seems like a technicality.
It matters because before this, the colonial assemblies paid the governor. If a governor started acting like a tyrant or just ignored the will of the people, the assembly could just threaten to withhold his paycheck. It was their main leverage.
Ah, I see. It was a check and balance.
Exactly. The Townshend Acts completely severed that link. Now, the governor gets paid directly by London using the colonists' own money. He no longer has to answer to the people he rules.
So let's recap the vibe in Boston in early 1770. You have soldiers in your spare room drinking your beer, you're paying taxes on your card games, and your political leverage over the governor is completely gone.
It's a powder keg.
It's amazing it took until March to blow up.
Well, the fuse was actually lit weeks before the massacre. There is a specific incident in the sources involving the manufactory house that often gets overlooked, but it is absolutely crucial context.
I saw this. It happened earlier in the same month, right? It almost feels like a prequel.
It really does. The manufactory house was a charitable building. It was a home for the poor, the sick, and the homeless. The British sheriff, a man named Greenleaf, tried to evict these vulnerable people specifically to turn the building into a barracks for more soldiers.
That is terrible optics, kicking out the sick to house the occupiers.
It was incredibly bad optics. But here's the key takeaway. The tenants refused to leave. They barricaded the doors. The locals supported them. The sheriff and the soldiers actually laid siege to the house, literally cutting off food and water. But the people stood their ground.
And the British backed down.
They did. And that taught the people of Boston a very dangerous lesson. If you stand up to the soldiers, they might blink.
Which brings us back to the snowy night of March 5th. Because this time, the soldiers didn't blink.
No, they didn't. And we have to set the scene accurately based on the accounts. It starts with a lone sentry, Private Hugh White, standing guard outside the custom house. He gets into an argument with a wig maker's apprentice over an unpaid bill.
It always starts with something petty, doesn't it? An unpaid bill.
A bill and an insult. Private White strikes the apprentice with the butt of his musket. A crowd gathers. The bells start ringing that false fire alarm we mentioned earlier. Suddenly, the streets are full of people.
And this isn't a peaceful protest. The sources describe the crowd throwing snowballs, sure, but also chunks of ice, oyster shells, and sticks.
It was a mob. Let's be very clear about that. They were pressing in on the soldiers, shouting, "Fire if you dare!" The soldiers, members of the 29th Regiment, were surrounded, vastly outnumbered, and likely terrified.
And then the snap occurs.
A club is thrown. A soldier goes down, a musket fires, then another, and another.
The sources are clear on the toll. 5 Bostonians were killed, several others wounded. And I really want to pause on the first man to fall, because his name is one of the most famous in American history, Crispus Attucks.
Yes, a man of significant heritage. He was born to a Native American mother and an African American father. He was a sailor, likely a runaway slave who had forged a life of freedom for himself.
It is a profound irony when you think about it. The first person to die in the struggle for American independence was a man of color who, legally speaking, wasn't even fully free in America.
It really is. But his death galvanized the movement. It proved that the fight for liberty wasn't just for the wealthy merchants. It involved the entire cross-section of colonial society.
So the shots are fired, the smoke clears, and the bodies are carried away. What happened next? We have this letter in the source stack from a man named Andrew Oliver Jr., written the very next day, March 6th.
That letter is amazing because it gives us the real sensory experience of the aftermath. He describes the bustle of the town and the beating of drums. You have to imagine the noise. The 29th Regiment was actually drawn up in battle formation. The Sons of Liberty were rallying. The city was on a knife edge.
It sounds like they were moments away from full-scale urban warfare.
They absolutely were. The only thing that prevented a total slaughter was the governor agreeing to arrest the soldiers and put them on trial for murder.
And that leads to the funerals. The sources mention that the Sons of Liberty, Sam Adams, Paul Revere, John Hancock, they organized these.
It was political theater at its absolute finest. They turned the funerals into this massive procession. Reports say 12,000 people attended.
Wow.
And remember, the population of the town was only 16,000. It united the colonies in grief and outrage in a way nothing else had.
So naturally, the soldiers who fired the shots were put on trial. And this is where the story takes a turn that I find just absolutely fascinating. If you were a British soldier in Boston in 1770, the most hated men in the city, who is the last person you would expect to defend you in court?
A leading patriot.
Exactly. But that is exactly who they got. The sources identify the defense lawyer as John Adams,
The future president of the United States.
the cousin of Sam Adams, the guy who is leading the protests. Why on earth would John Adams defend the enemy? Was he just looking for a paycheck?
Not at all. In fact, he knew it would damage his reputation. This is the real aha moment regarding the values of that era. John Adams was a patriot, yes.
Yeah.
But he was also deeply loyal to the concept of justice. He believed that if the fight for liberty was going to mean anything at all, it had to be built on the rule of law.
So he's thinking, if we deny these men a fair trial just because we hate them, we are no better than the tyranny we are fighting.
Precisely. A free society cannot exist if the mob gets to decide who lives and who dies. So he took the case. And he didn't just phone it in. He mounted a vigorous defense.
What was his strategy, though? I mean, there were dead bodies in the snow. How do you argue against that?
He argued self-defense. He famously said, facts are stubborn things. He dismantled the eyewitness testimony, proving that the mob was dangerous, that the soldiers were being assaulted with heavy ice and clubs, and that they genuinely feared for their lives. He forced the jury to look at the hard reality, not just their emotion.
And the verdict.
It shocked people then, and it still surprises people now. 6 of the soldiers were found not guilty. They walked free.
Wow. Completely acquitted.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, 2 of them, Kilroy and Montgomery, were found guilty, but not of murder. They were convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter.
And this is where the notes get a little weird. They weren't executed. The source says they were branded on the thumb. What is that about?
Right, this requires a bit of legal history to understand. It's an old English legal tradition called benefit of clergy. Originally, it was for clergymen, but by 1770, it was a way for first-time offenders of manslaughter to escape the death penalty.
So it was essentially a legal loophole.
Sort of. They would brand the convict's thumb with a hot iron, specifically the letter M for manslaughter, right there in open court. The idea was to permanently mark them so they couldn't ever claim that benefit again.
So they were scarred for life, but they kept their heads.
Yes. And think about what that verdict says overall. A Boston juryman who lived under the occupation, who hated the taxes, looked at the evidence and decided to spare the soldiers. It proved that the colonies were capable of true justice. It wasn't just mob rule.
That is a deeply complex legacy. And speaking of legacy, if you go to Boston today, you can actually stand right where this happened.
That's right. There is a circle of cobblestones at the intersection of State and Congress streets right outside the old State House. It's a very powerful place to stand.
It is. But I want to pivot slightly here. We've looked at the politics, the economics, and the law. But our source stack includes something that frames this struggle for freedom in a totally different light, a spiritual one.
This is a really interesting addition to the deep dive. The sources include a passage from the Book of Mormon, specifically Ether chapter 2.
Right, verses 10 and 12. It talks about this land being a choice land.
It frames the concept of freedom through a religious lens, which, we have to remember, was the default setting for many colonists at that time. The text asserts that any nation possessing this land shall be free from bondage and from captivity if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ.
So the idea here is that freedom isn't just a political right you fight for, it's a spiritual condition you maintain.
Exactly. The source connects the preservation of freedom directly to service, serving God, and serving your fellow man. It implies that liberty is conditional. You aren't just guaranteed freedom forever, you have to earn the right to keep it through your moral conduct.
That actually mirrors a lot of the rhetoric we see from the pulpit in the 1770s, that faith and the fight for liberty were deeply intertwined. They didn't see them as separate circles.
No, they were overlapping circles.
Mm-hmm.
For many people back then, resisting tyranny was a religious duty. But equally, they believed that if the people became corrupt, if they abandoned that service mentioned in the text, then the protection would be lifted and bondage would return.
Which brings it all back to John Adams, doesn't it? When he defended those soldiers, he was arguably upholding that moral standard. He was ensuring the society remained just.
That is a great connection. If the colonists had just executed those soldiers out of revenge, they would have lost their moral high ground completely. By giving them a fair trial, they demonstrated that they were actually worthy of self-governance.
So let's zoom out and look at the whole picture here. We started with the crushing weight of the occupation, the Stamp Act, the Townsend Acts, the soldiers in your living room,
The daily grinding friction.
which leads directly to the snowy streets, the rocks, the shots fired, and 5 tragic deaths. But then the story doesn't end with a riot, it ends with a trial.
A trial where the enemy is given a robust defense. It's a remarkable arc, and it reminds us that the Boston Massacre wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific bad policies colliding with intense human emotion.
And it makes you wonder, if you were living in Boston then, how would you have reacted? If someone told you that you had to feed and house a soldier who was policing your neighborhood, would you have been throwing rocks too?
It's a really fair question. We like to think we'd be perfectly calm, but the pressure was immense.
And here's the thought I want to leave you with today. It goes back to John Adams. He defended the very soldiers who fired on his neighbors because he believed in the process of law more than he believed in revenge.
It's the ultimate test of values.
So ask yourself, if John Adams could do that, what does that tell us about the cost of maintaining a free society today? Is true freedom just about getting rid of the things we hate? Or is it about maintaining the rule of law when it is most difficult to do so?
That is the question that defines democracy.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Boston Massacre.
It's been a pleasure.
See you next time. Thank you for joining us for this day in his story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in his story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.